appreciate that people did move up a little bit. This room isn't exactly set up as a round table, so if the impulse strikes you to move up even closer at any point, don't feel inhibited. And the sort of format is, I'll introduce myself first. So I'm Bing Powell from the University of Rochester, also president-elect of APSA this year, and I've been asked to serve as a sort of chair and facilitator or some role like that for this roundtable. I'll certainly do the best I can, although with such a good group of panelists, I'm not worried that there will be any problem. So here's the plan. Let me introduce the members of the panel, and then I'll just say a few words about some of the topics that we're supposed to deal with. Then each of the panelists has prepared about 5 minutes worth of informal remarks, some general, some focusing on particular topics. And then we'll throw it open to the group to ask questions. And so hopefully we can have a kind of roundtable that has interactions with the audience, because we're really here, we hope, for your benefit, and we're glad that you came, and we want to do everything that we can to be helpful and facilitate your role. So let me just introduce the panel first. Just want to wave your hand or whatever. Lisa Garcia Bedolla from the University of California, Berkeley. Kerry Haynie from Duke. Tasha Philpot from Texas, Austin. Paula McClain from Duke. And Timothy Kaufman-Osborn from Whitman College. Okay. And I want to express, as I'm sure you will, and I'll try to remember to do this at the end, but I always tend to forget, to express the thanks to the panel for being here and for participating in this. So we do really appreciate your coming. So as I understand it, there was a sort of survey of the people who were planning on coming as to what topics having to do with professional development and career patterns you were interested in hearing about. And so this set, which involved things like the preparation of tenure files and balancing teaching and research and publishing and tenure files and how to get letters for them, were issues that were raised by some of you. There were some other issues. These were all issues raised by multiple people, as I understand it, in one form or another. And there were other issues that were just raised by a person or two. But if your questions weren't on this kind of general list, or if the things that we say don't cover what you're interested in, why, that's the purpose of the questions and the discussions. So please follow up. I would suggest, if you don't mind, that when each of the panelists makes their comments, that you hold your questions about that until everybody's had a chance to speak, because what will almost certainly happen is that there will be overlap in the comments that people will make. And so the questions that you will ask are likely going to be answered by another panelist. But just make a note of your questions, and after we've each had this little 5 minutes worth of remark, then pitch in and we'll be more than happy to respond. So let me just get us started by saying a few things about each of these topics as they occurred to me. I thought they were all excellent topics in the career development line. And the thing I really wanted to say first, for everybody in the audience to understand that there are many paths of career development. And the panelists and myself here, we cover a fair range of institutions and types of institutions. And you're going to find that we have different experiences among ourselves as to the best ways to handle these questions. And any of the patterns and responses that you see here may not apply to your institution. So really the thing I want to emphasize, insofar as you're hoping to draw lessons from this roundtable for your own career development and professional concerns, is to think very carefully about the circumstances of your institution, the one you're in right now or the one you're about to move into if you're at that career stage, and find out what their rules are, the formal ones and especially the informal ones. This is the way the system really works. The chair should explain that to you, your first day. But some chairs are great at this, others not so much. Some delegate it, some don't. So it's up to you in the end to find out what really works at your institution. So try to take from what we say things that you find interesting or relevant, make some notes about it, but don't assume that one size fits all, because it really doesn't. At least that's the way I look at it. And anything I say here is completely subject to disconfirmation and rejection by the members. Kim just asked me to go first, so. So let me just say a couple words about each one of these topics in turn. So tenure file preparation, if you're approaching that career stage, and it doesn't hurt to think ahead to that, even if that seems like a long distance in the future, it will come up very quickly, that's for sure. And just a couple of things, and in some sense, everything that you do and the answers to all the other questions about publishing and balancing teaching and research are all, in a way, preparations for putting together a good tenure file. But just a couple of things that occur to me. Again, different institutions want different things. Find out exactly what your institution wants. Most institutions want some kind of a research statement. They obviously want a good CV. Find out what it's supposed to look like at your institution, what should be there and what shouldn't. Mostly they're going to want a research statement. They're going to want a teaching statement. They're going to want documentation of your teaching successes. They're going to want a list, or probably you're going to be asked to give them a set of your publications and so forth. Do this carefully and keep in mind that you have two audiences in these teaching and research statements. One hand, you're speaking to the other the tenured members of your faculty and explaining what you're all about and what your objective is. And they may know you personally. They will know you personally. This will vary at different sizes of institutions, how well they will know you. But they may not know, the sequence of your research and how it fits together. And so you want to create both a convincing story to them that tells them what you're really about. And then also this will go in your file that will be sent to outside reviewers, so you're speaking to them too, and don't assume they know anything about these circumstances. And it's my experience, which again the panel members may disagree, that if there's matters of fact that are subject to different interpretations, it's good for you to give the reader the interpretation. So if, like me, you wandered into a big introductory course your very first semester and you bombed out, never having stood in front of a large audience before, and everything went badly, but the next time you taught it, you were great. Be sure and point that out in your teaching statement. Outside readers and faculties alike love development and growth, and sometimes they will usually be looking for that and try to find it, but don't leave it to their imagination. If you've got a growth story and a development story, tell that story and putting those files together. Be sure and ask what sort of documentation they want, teaching evaluations, whatever it is, so that you can have the file. Again, somebody to whom you give this to should say, no, something is missing, but don't count on that. Be sure and find out exactly what should be there. And you'll hear more about this from some of the other panel members who are particularly devoted to this. Second, balancing teaching and research. So we all, this is one of the toughest things about our business. We sort of both do teaching and research. And what I've got to say about this is just two things. One, again, find out what is really wanted at your institution. They're all going to tell you they both love teaching and they love research. You're going to hear that. You can count on it. It's all going to sort of be true. But some value one thing much more than the others. And sometimes what it says on paper and in the official statements of your college or university or your department may not really accord with what's taken into account. And I can only speak from my own experience, which was teaching at a small research university. Now, my university, I think, does value teaching. I think it is important. But I must say that when push comes to shove in those tenure decisions, those publications that you've got down on paper count a lot more than what you did in the classroom. And I hate to admit it, but I think that's just the truth. And so you've got to, and this is important to keep in mind throughout your career. You can't put the research record together at the last minute. You've got to be thinking about this. And the pressure to perform in the classroom is always there because the students are there and you probably like doing that, and that's great. But keep together the other objectives. The other thing, just would mention, sometimes you have a lot of flexibility about what to teach. Sometimes you have no flexibility at all. So again, adapt it to your circumstances. But if you get flexibility, find out two things. One, what the hell you're good at. Because most of us are good at some things and not good at others. So some of us are great at sitting around a round table, and others are great in front of the classroom and they're natural show people. And others freeze when we're in kind of an audience. Find out what you're good at and see if you can teach what you're good at. And second, see if you can develop some synergy between your research and your teaching. See if you can find some courses that make use of what your research is and will help stimulate you and stimulate the students by the interaction between, because you're almost inevitably excited about the stuff that you do research on. And that will help in the teaching. But also doing the same thing will make it easier to do both. But it's one of the really tough perennial problems of our discipline. And of course, related to that in the research is publishing. And I have one great message about this, and probably everybody has the same one. Persistence, persistence, persistence. That great paper that you wrote, but isn't quite good enough and sits in your desk drawer is never going to get you tenure. You've got to send it out there. Or what works best, give it as a paper at a conference. Get some feedback. Get some practice delivering it. Send it out there to the best journal you think that has a good chance at. Don't let your just before tenure to do that, because journals have long turnaround times. You've got to anticipate this. Send it out there. It's going to get rejected. The top journals, 9 pieces out of 10 that are sent in are rejected. For heaven's sakes, don't take this as a crushing blow to your ego and the fact that you're a failure. 9 out of 10 sent in by the best scholars are rejected at the APSR and the AJPS and the JOP. But a lot of those pieces, the majority of those pieces that are rejected are published someplace. So find to start out with a good general journal. Tenure committees love that. But if that doesn't work, and again, the odds are it won't, try another top journal if you've got time. If not, go down to something slightly less prestigious, but more appropriate to the subject matter, and send it out, send it out, send it out. Persistence. I just can't say that enough, because I've just seen so many really smart people who don't publish as much as they should because they want that perfect job. They want that perfect paper that nobody is going to criticize. And they send it out and they get a crushing response from some stupid reviewer who had an off day. Right? We all know about these stupid reviewers that have off days. Every one of us has seen them. You just can't let that crush you. And if the reviewer comments are stupid and you know the paper is good and some other people you have confidence in like it, send it out without changing a word. If the reviewer comments are smart, then change the mild way, but it's not going to go to the same reviewers. And so you've got to think about the general, not the specifics. So finally, tenure files. So several people are going to talk more about this than I do in this business about outside letters. My only take on this is, again, be sure and find out exactly what the rules are at your institution and try to make them work for you. At our institution, the candidate is invited to submit a list of potential reviewers at tenure time and 1 or 2 vetoes. And if you've given this paper out a bunch of places and you've made some of the contacts, you know who your enemies are, who those stupid people are there that don't understand the purpose of your research. Don't hesitate to use a veto or 2 and say, don't send it to so-and-so. That's okay. The problem is that these suggestions from the candidate are identified as such when it goes to the higher university levels. And the good ones tend to be discounted if they come from the candidate. Now, your thesis advisor is going to be discounted anyway, but you've got to have him or her on the panel. So just write that off. But at our institution, the way we work it is the candidate creates such a list but does not turn it in until after the department has created a list. And then if there's overlap between the 2 lists, the overlaps are reported to the dean only as coming from the department. And so that helps the credibility. Whether your system is set up in a way that you can help game the system, I have no idea, but take every advantage. You're political scientists, for heaven's sakes. Right? You should know about these strategic behavior kind of things, or local culture things, if you like to think of it that way, if that makes you feel more comfortable. Okay, let me just turn it over to the panel. Should we just go in order, or does somebody want to lead us off?
I'll nominate Lisa.
Okay, so thanks so much to Kim for organizing this. I think it is really important to get this information to people, and especially with the wealth of knowledge that is sitting on this table, I'm honored to be in such amazing company. So I was asked to talk about service and learning what is expected. So in terms of service, in particular, the question of saying no to service. And so one thing that I want those of you in the room who are junior people or who are about to be junior people is to remember that the one thing about the tenure clock is it is finite. You have a finite number of minutes of time before you have to come up, and you really have to think of your time that way so that every moment you spend doing something is you're not doing something else. And I think, for me at least, that helped me to conceptualize why I needed to be very clear and bounded about how I distributed my time. And so when you get asked to do something, and I think it's especially hard for people to say no when it's someone who's their friend, and often that happens, is turn it back around on them and say, look, you know, I'm doing this, this, and this. Remind them of all the other things you're doing and say, and I'm really worried about, you know, balancing my time for tenure. What do you think I should do? Do you think this is something I should be spending time on? And often that will help, especially if it's your friend, to sort of have them go back and say, well, wait a minute, you really should not be, or you could be, or to really think about how to fit that request into the other responsibilities that you've been asked to do. And the reality is, as a junior person, you do have to say yes sometimes. And I think we don't talk enough about how to say yes. And so the way to think about saying yes is to make certain that the service that you're doing works for you in the sense of teaching you something either about your department or the broader institution. So for example, at my institution, we have a tradition that junior people serve on personnel. And while that's a pretty big time commitment, I think it's incredibly time well spent, because it means you read the files, you know what people's files look like, you know what the conversations are, you know the kinds of things that people are talking about, and so you can really be strategic when you're putting your information together to be just sure to address all the things that people have brought up. It's sort of like peeking behind the curtain before you actually are put in front of the wizard, right? And then also, if you have to do university-wide service, or you're asked to do university-wide service, make sure it puts you on committees where you're going to be able to access decision makers on your campus so that they know you, and then do it well, right? So if you have really important administrators and you serve on a committee, you need to show up on time, and you need to actually be prepared as a junior person, because that's how you build allies across campus who will be paying attention when your file comes up, and who can be your advocates outside your department to help you get through the process. So make sure, if you're, yes, okay, a committee that only meets once a year may be fine in terms of giving you a line of service and not being an incredible burden, but you need to also learn your structure, and service is a good way of doing that, as long as you make sure to balance it and not take on things that are too much responsibility. Search committees are a huge time suck. Say no. Right, that's the big one that I think a lot of people don't realize how much time it takes up, and you're going to get into the middle of fights you want nothing to do with. And so that would be one of the things that you would really want to avoid like the plague, if at all possible. In terms of figuring out what's expected in terms of tenure, just to repeat, every institution has its expectations, its rules. I know this is going to sound basic, but at our institution, in the UC system, actually, the academic personnel offices have all been really good about putting handbooks and information online for junior faculty, and a lot of junior faculty don't read them. And so, at the very least, you should find out what your institution has that's available to everyone, and go to all of those workshops that the academic personnel office puts together. In addition to getting good information, you network with other junior people across campus, and you come to the attention of the people on campus whose job it is to make sure that the tenure process works properly. The other thing that it's really useful to do is have lunch with senior people in your department and ask them what they think is the expectation in your department for tenure, even people who are not in your field. And this can feel awkward and weird and uncomfortable. But it's really useful, because if you triangulate all the information you get from all those people, they're all going to tell you slightly different things. You'll get a good sense of what kind of the broad expectations are, and you'll get those folks to be more invested in your success in general, because they've talked to you. Something about breaking bread with people, it creates intimacy and is important. And that's something that you can't expect them, even though senior faculty should do this with junior faculty, they often don't. And so it's incumbent upon you to sort of let people know who you are, especially people outside your field, and talk to them about the tenure process, and to do this early. You don't want to do this all in your tenure year, but have conversations in an ongoing way throughout the time that you're in the department. And the last thing I just want to say is, I feel like when I was in graduate school, I was not taught to see myself as an agent in my career, that I sort of was left to think that I was at the mercy of, search committees and decision makers and departments, and there's this very kind of passive, disempowered feeling that I think a lot of junior faculty feel, and I think a lot of the angst that comes out of being junior comes out of that, and I would just ask you to sort of feel like you have the power to decide what kind of professional life you want. You can decide what kind of research you want to do. You can decide whether or not you have a family and how much time you spend on that. You can decide. You have to be clear for yourself what kind of life you want and whether the institution you're at actually gives you the life you need, and if it doesn't, go to another institution. It's possible to move, rather than trying to adjust yourself to fit whatever space you're in. And I think a lot of people do that and they end up really unhappy. And so I would encourage you all to realize that this job is important, but it's part of your life, and to find a balance and an intellectual space that really works for you to feed all parts of your soul, not just the intellectual side.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was great.
Good afternoon. I'm Kerry Haynie from Duke University, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about co-authoring and professional networking. And I'll start with the co-authoring piece. And this is an area that's always tricky when it comes time for tenure. Let me start by saying that there's greater acceptance in the discipline of co-authored work. You look in the journals and you see book publications, there's much more co-authoring work. There's some studies of this, and we see much more co-authoring in the discipline than in years past. But let me caution you in the way that Bing and Lisa did. Make sure you know what your institution is looking for. I mean, this is a debate about how much co-authoring there should be and what types and with whom is it acceptable. But I see it as a plus on the whole, that it demonstrates your ability to work with others, that you are contributing to a network of scholars, and I think those things are important to demonstrate. However, it's incumbent and important upon you to also be able to demonstrate to your departmental colleagues and to the committees at the higher levels what your individual contribution, your intellectual contribution is to a project or to projects. So on the one hand, it could be an advantage to have co-authors. I think sometimes work is better. We have different skills that we bring to a project, and it can make an overall project better to have a set of co-authors. But I also think it's the case, and it remains the case at most institutions, that your colleagues want to know what is your particular individual intellectual contribution. And it's hard to determine that when you're looking at a dossier and you see lots of co-authored pieces. And a couple of rules of thumb I think are still true, and my colleagues here may have different views. If you co-author with your thesis advisor, you won't get the credit that you may deserve with that. Now, that's not to say don't do it, because it could be a nice publication for the CV that you get some credit for research productivity and activity. But you can't rely on a piece in the APSA even with your thesis advisor as something that's going to get you over the hurdle. Because oftentimes those, rightly or wrongly, I think the reality is that committees looking at these works will assume that your thesis advisor was the important intellectual force behind the work. Again, and as I said to some colleagues at a previous job, you don't know my advisor in my committee, who I think highly of, but there was sort of suggestion that my first project was sort of discounted when it was time to come up with tenure, that they considered that to be a co-authored work, the dissertation book. Even though it had my name on it, what we noticed developed with your committee. So find out what the expectations of your institutions are when it comes to co-authoring. And questions like with whom and how much is acceptable are important questions to ask. With thesis advisors, I think yes, but certainly not too much of that. With other senior colleagues, it's another tricky area. Committees, again, rightly or wrongly, might interpret that the fact that someone's senior to you, that they're the intellectual heavyweight in a particular project. And we all know that often that's not the case. And in fact, it's more often the case that the junior person has newer ideas, knows better methods and more advanced methods, and they're driving the project in some ways, or at least equal contributor. But when committees meet and discuss these things, more often than not, you won't get the credit from pieces that are co-authored with more senior colleagues. And this may vary by subfield as well. So, I mean, again, it's important to find out what the expectations are, because some subfields is more co-authoring than others. There are expectations that you have single author pieces. I think in political theory, for example, I think that may be one subfield where it's still quite a bit of single authored work and less co-authoring than in others. So find out what the norms are in your subfield, not only in your institution, but in the subfield as well. But again, it's important for you, the single most important thing with your dossier is that you can demonstrate what your intellectual contribution is. And most places will have some standard that there's some single authored major work in the file, be that a seminal article or a set of articles, some of which in that set might be co-authored, or a book. So again, ask the questions and make sure you have something that can demonstrate your contribution. Some committees might want you in co-authored work to may have a letter in the file from the co-author attesting to your contribution or the division of labor in a project. So find that out as well. And I hope you have questions about this because I'd like to hear my colleagues' view on this as well. The other thing that I'll mention is networking, professional networking. This was the biggest surprise to me when a few years before I came up for tenure, that I realized that there was something called outside letters being referenced. And sort of that, and the nature of these letters would be from people in the profession who I may or may not know, certainly wouldn't know who the university has solicited for letters. So it's important that you are doing what you're doing here. You're out at the conferences, presenting your work, participating in intellectual discussions, short courses, and research projects. Because the professional networking is extremely important. I think one of the most important things in the file are the outside letters. Because what these letters are used for, at least at my institution, it's not only to get an assessment of the quality of your work, but it's also a check on the department. Because the department makes a judgment and sends it forward, but these outside evaluators are independent of the department's judgment. And the committees at the higher levels pay attention to those letters. So it's important to be known, and that when letters are solicited, that the folks in your area have some sense of you and your work. And so that's key, that's important. At most institutions, you need 5, 6, 7, 8 letters. And oftentimes the committee will have to solicit 10, 15, 20 letters to get the 5, 6, or 7. So it's important to be known widely in your area and in the discipline at large. So participate in conferences. Again, manage the time doing it. There's some cost to doing this, but you have to be active and be out and visible for the purposes of letter writers. Networking also, in addition to giving exposure to you and your work, it provides you with opportunities for some professional service. Again, in limited amounts, professional service can be an important part of your tenure file. Because again, it demonstrates to your internal university committees that you are someone that the profession takes seriously, that you are contributing to the larger life of the profession. And finally, networking provides, I think something that's quite important for us is continuous learning. That, again, once we get stuck in our own little narrow areas and doing our own research, we sort of lose that time to think and reflect and engage. So coming to a conference and entering into a dialogue with others about my work and their work provides an opportunity for us to continually learn and I think improve and expand our work in new ideas and in new ways.
Thanks very much, Kerry. That was great. Tasha?
Okay.
So I'm going to focus on balancing teaching and research. Like what was already said, you really do need to know what your institution's expectations are. Are you primarily at a teaching institution where you have to have glowing teaching evaluations in order to get tenure? Is it more balanced where research and teaching are treated equally? Or is it where research is the most important and you just don't have to fail as a teacher? That's really important when you know when you're trying to figure out how to allocate your time. One of the things that was helpful for me when I was a junior faculty was that my chair allowed me to repeat my courses every semester, and so I wasn't doing new preparations. As you know, if you've started in your position, prepping a course is incredibly time-consuming, and so if you're doing new preps, even if you want to teach it, I have a friend who's got, I think, like 13 courses prepped, and to me that I just can't even wrap my head around it. He likes it and he's excited about every course that he teaches, but that's time taken away from some other area of your career. And so if you're able to repeat those courses, or at least limit, have a few number of courses in your rotation, that frees up a lot of time that you can devote to some other area of your career. If you have to come up with new preps for courses, find things that are directly related to your research areas, and particularly things that you're working on now. So as you're reading to develop a syllabus, you're not just reading for the student's sake, but you're also reading articles and books and book chapters that are going to be helpful as you work on an article or your book or whatever you're working on at that time. I would say, don't overtax yourself with grading. So it's really great that you want to be the best professor ever and you want to be the best teacher ever, and you have all these assignments that are geared towards developing critical thinking skills and helping students really relate to the material. But remember, every assignment that you assign is an assignment you have to grade. And grading is also very time consuming. And so I'm not saying, just have one exam at the semester, but, to have 2 exams plus a term paper plus weekly term paper, plus, weekly reactions to the readings and pop quizzes. I mean, you're going to be spending your whole semester grading. Utilize your teaching assistants. If you have a teaching assistant, let them do their job. That's what they're paid for. I had a colleague who insisted that his grade distribution be a perfect bell curve. And so the teaching assistant would, hand back the grades. He would analyze the grade distribution, and if it wasn't, perfectly, normal shaped, he would go back and regrade some of those papers. What a horrible waste of time. I mean, unless you're failing all of your students, they're not going to complain. So, half the class gets A's. I guarantee you, students are not coming to your office hours if they're all passing with the grade they want. Also, set boundaries with your students. If you're at a big public institution, like I am, I have 400 students this semester. Even if a quarter of them sent me an email a day, it's a lot of emails. So what I do is say, I'm going to take this time out of my day to answer students' emails so that I'm not consistently answering emails over and over again. If you're trying to work on finishing a chapter out of your, a book you're trying to write or an article, the stopping and starting and stopping and starting is also kind of distracting, and it takes a lot of time away from your research. And so say, I'm going to take this time and set aside that amount of time. And it's okay to let students wait. I mean, they're used to instant gratification, but if they have to wait, 2 to 3 hours to answer a question that if they looked at their syllabus, they could probably answer themselves, they'll be okay. Kerry's already talked about co-authorship, but I will say I'm a big fan of co-authorship, but again, you have to understand what your institution's expectations for co-authoring is. So if you know that it's going to be completely discounted if you're co-authoring with senior colleagues or your advisor, then it's probably not worth your time to do it. Certainly if you're finishing up projects that you've already started, go ahead and do it. More publications has never hurt anybody either. But if you're thinking about future projects, you probably want to find a peer, someone who's within your rank or not too far away from it to co-author with, as opposed to someone who's a little bit more senior. Tied to that, don't put all of your eggs in one basket. Really try to find a way to have multiple research projects going at one time. My advisor said the lucky number was 7, which,
7.
yeah. which I've never been able to do, and to my knowledge, he's the only person who's been able to do it. But he said 7 is the lucky number, meaning you should have some things that are in draft form, some things that are out for review, some things that are under revise and resubmit, some things that are in press and, you know, at different stages, and 7 would guarantee you tenure. I never had 7. So you can adjust that accordingly. But the advice is still good, meaning that if you understand the timing of publishing, especially now with, you know, it could take up to a year just to get the first decision on an article that's submitted. If you're banking, you know, everything you have, your whole career on that one article that may or may not get into the APSR, and it's taken a year just to get the decision, which may or may not be positive, you've just wasted, you know, a year, a full year of a 5-year clock or a 6-year clock. So make sure that you have multiple projects that you can be working on in the meantime while you're waiting for decisions. A year and a half is not that untypical to wait for a decision. And if you're working on a book, that can take up to 2 years to come into print. So make sure that you have things, and that's not even on your side. So there's like this this magical point in when you're publishing a book called in press, when you have no control over anything. It's just somewhere. It's just somewhere, and you're waiting for that. Sometimes, if you're going up, if it's pushing up against your clock, departments will accept page proofs as fine in terms of your tenure dossier, but some people want the book on the table. So understand the timing of publishing. Going back to teaching, and I think this also relates to research, in order to kind of maintain your mental health, part of it is just having fun with it. Find topics to teach and to research that are not just things that are you know, that are service courses for your department or subjects that you think are in vogue for the day, but find things that genuinely excite you. And as long as you're having fun, you get more work done, the students like it more, it kind of comes along in your research, you're able to sustain it longer. And so that would be my concluding remarks, is just to have fun with your career.
After you get tenure.
No, while you're getting tenure. You can have fun pre-tenure. I mean, and by fun, I mean sitting in front of a computer for several hours. Yeah.
One of the things I want to repeat a couple of the points that Bing made, and I think Kerry and Lisa made, and that is why it really is important to get to know the system of the institution where you are. We are so varied in terms of the number of committees that you have to go through, whether or not it goes from the department to the college to the provost, or whether it goes from the department straight up to the provostial level. You really have to understand what the process is where you are. Because you also have to understand that tenure decisions from the institution standpoint are multi-million-dollar decisions. So they're going to make a decision on you in the 5th or 6th year for a bet that in year 20 or year 30, your trajectory is going to be continuing to go up. At some point when you get close to retirement, it might plateau out, you know, but they don't want you after year 5 to plateau and then head down, which is one reason why we do not give tenure only on teaching. Because what you have in year 6 is exactly what you're going to have in year 20 and year 30. And if your institution is one that sees itself as aspirational to move up, they're going to want people who do research that help them move up. And if you're already one of the top institutions, you want people who are going to keep you where you are. Which means that puts a lot of pressure on junior faculty depending on where your department is within the university hierarchy. Is it a top-ranked political science department, or is it a department that the institution has aspirations for? And if we can hire and tenure some really good young people, that's going to help us move up. And so as you're thinking about these things, one of the things you should understand, and it's really easy to do, I mean, we all do it, is you think that the very last tenure decision that your department made should tell you something about your chances. Well, Sharon had a book and 6 refereed articles. I have a book and 6 refereed articles, therefore I should get tenure. Well, maybe someone paid attention to Sharon's book and 6 articles, and the letters that came in from the outside reviewers were just glowing about how this particular set of work changed the paradigm that we think about whatever it is Sharon was doing. And your book and 6 articles, no one paid any attention to. No one cared. The citations are really low. And so the letters come back about this is like the 46th person that's addressed the same question in the literature. Okay, so you really have to focus and think about yourself being in competition with yourself, doing the best that you can do, making and finding interesting questions or identify interesting questions that will put you on a trajectory where your outside letter writers will say, you know, this person is still dealing with representation, but my goodness, this is a different way to look at what we're thinking about in terms of representation, because you have to understand that once your file leaves the department, it goes up to these committees of people who, particularly scientists, who could care less about political science, whose vocabulary moves beyond vote, okay, or representation. And so they're going to be looking for things in the file that they can identify with from their particular disciplines. And so they're going to look for the code words of, you know, tremendous potential. This person is going to be a star. Now, there's no Nobel Prize for political science, so we're not going to get that in our letters, right? Not yet. Not yet. That, you know, this is a potential Nobel winner. But, and outside letter writers know how to write these letters. And committees know how to read these letters. And they read a lot between the lines. So what someone may think is a positive letter, other people on the committee can read hedges, nuanced hedges. And so it becomes important to understand, once again, in terms of learning your institution, what its expectations are for those letters. Now, my institution, Duke, and I'm just going to use this because this is, you know, an example of how our system may differ. We have an expectation of 8 to 10 letters that go up with the files. But we also have this thing called arm's length, which means no one you were in graduate school with, of course not your dissertation advisor, no one that you co-authored with, no one that you went on vacation with who might say in the letter, well, you know, yeah, I'm arm's length, but oh, by the way, you know, our beach houses are next to each other, so we sit on each other's porches during that. That actually was in a letter, by the way.
Well, that's arm's length.
Which, of course, killed the letter, okay, from a very important person. But so you need to get a sense, and this goes back to Kerry's point about networking. You can become known and get to know people without becoming their buddies, without becoming their friend. So that when they write these letters, they write it from, I know this person professionally, I heard her give this paper on a panel, I've read some of the published work, I consider us professional associates, we are not personal friends. Okay, because the minute there's the hint in the letter that there's some personal connection, that letter gets tossed. Okay, so you have to understand what your institution requires. And one of the easiest places to find it is the faculty handbook. Now, we all have these. We put them on a shelf. Nobody pulls them out. Now, everything is online. But everything you need to know about the formal process at your institution is going to be in this handbook. Like I said, I actually read mine now because I, chaired APT, but before that, but it's important. It's important. Another thing that I want to say, and then I will turn it over to Tim, and we can get back to some of these things, is in the question and answer. You have to understand that the bar is always shifting. It's always shifting, and you just have to accept it. No amount of complaining or, well, John got tenure 10 years ago with this, and now they're holding me to a higher standard. Yes, that's the way it is. And if you start approaching this from a carping standpoint, all you're doing is kind of showing your own insecurities about your own work. Just accept the fact that the bar shifts and that your aim is to get over it, okay, based on what the standards are at the time. Remember, these are multi-million-dollar decisions, and institutions take them very seriously. And also, you don't want to piss off your colleagues, right? By saying, John got tenure, he's lousy, no one read his work, and then another colleague goes and tells John, and John says, oh, well, yeah, okay, well, I've got news for you when you come through. So just, being professional in so many different ways while understanding exactly what the process is, I think will take you a long way.
Thanks, Paula.
Move the mic.
The curse of coming last, of course, is that I'm not sure that I have much to add, but I've got my prepared remarks, and by golly, I intend to deliver them. Here we go. When Kim gave us a list of possible topics to address, I selected tenure file preparation, and I did so because, for better or worse, I come to this topic from 3 different vantage points. Many years ago, I went through the tenure process and emerged relatively unscathed, the key word being relatively, I think, in that sentence. Not too many years after, I served a 3-year term on our personnel committee, which is an elected faculty committee charged with reviewing and advancing recommendations regarding all tenure track faculty who are candidates for contract renewal, tenure, and or promotion. And more recently, in my capacity as provost and dean of the faculty at Whitman, and yes, I have in fact turned entirely to the dark side now, but in that capacity, I've been serving as an ex officio non-voting member of the personnel committee, and as such, I'm the recipient of the recommendations generated by that committee on all contract renewal, tenure, and promotion cases, and it's my responsibility to advance those recommendations for approval or rejection by the President and ultimately by the Board of Trustees. What I'm going to try to do in the remaining time I have available to me is offer 3 simple rules which, if followed, will guarantee a successful tenure bid. But before I offer those 3 rules, I want to offer 2 caveats. One is that, unlike my colleagues on this panel, the limitation of my perspective is that I come from a small private liberal arts college, and the norms are different there, and that should be kept in mind. The second caveat that I would want to introduce is the 3 rules that I'm about to expound, I think it's important to recall, are increasingly irrelevant. And what I mean by that is that the excuse me, tenure track position, as I'm sure you know, is increasingly a relic of the past. And in our current neoliberal economic regime, I see little reason to expect a reversal of that decline. And in this regard, I'm going to quote from a 2010 article published in the Chronicle entitled cheerfully, "Tenure RIP." I quote, over just 3 decades, the proportion of college instructors who are tenured or on the tenure track plummeted from 57% in 1975 to 31% in 2007. A new report still quoting, issued by the U.S. Education Department is expected to show that that proportion fell below 30% in 2009. And then finally the quotation reads, if you add graduate teaching assistants to the mix, those with some kind of tenure status represent a mere quarter of all instructors. And I don't think we've seen the bottom in this trend yet. I expect predictions suggest that this will probably drop down to about 15 to 20% eventually, and then hopefully bottom out at that point. Commenting on these numbers, Stanley, these are depressing figures, aren't they? Commenting on these numbers, Stanley Katz at Princeton stated, we may be approaching a situation in which there will not be good tenure track jobs for the great majority of good people, unquote. So I recognize that any counsel I have on this issue increasingly applies to a very small and very elite proportion of those working in the academy today. So with that said, here are my 3 simple rules to guarantee, indeed, a successful tenure bid. 1, repeating a point that has been made several times already today, when you enter a tenure track position, learn the local tenure culture of the institution of which you are now a member. And I want to suggest 3 ways in which you can proceed with that self-education. 1, find a tenured member. I would argue, I think, preferably from a neighboring rather than your own department to serve as a kind of mentor. Hopefully your institution will have a formal mentoring program in place. If it does not, find a mentor anyhow. Work out the ground rules of that relationship, insisting on confidentiality and insisting on the fact that your mentor will not participate in the evaluation process for tenure. Share with that mentor your teaching evaluations, your scholarship, your annual activity reports, your syllabi. Ask that mentor to give you honest feedback about those documents in light of your institution's tenure criteria, and ask your mentor to help you prepare and organize the materials you submit in conjunction with your tenure review. One way to enhance your education. Second, don't wait until you're going up for tenure to familiarize yourself with the tenure review process as well as the criteria of evaluation for tenure. Moreover, whenever possible, find out what those criteria mean, how they have been applied, and how they have been interpreted in your particular department. Last year, in an effort to promote this cause, I asked all of our departments at Whitman College to prepare discipline-specific statements indicating what they believe the college's general criteria of evaluation mean in each department. And those have now been prepared, and my hope is that this will be of help in part to the members of our personnel committee, but even more so to our untenured tenure track faculty in giving them some better sense, some clearer sense of what their departments expect of them. This has also, this little exercise, which met with some resistance, I should add, but this exercise has also, I think, forced departments to collectively articulate the standards that should guide their letters of evaluation of junior candidates rather than rely on some amorphous or intuitive sense of what they mean in any individual case. I have no doubt that the process of generating those guidelines caused some interesting conflict within certain departments. Third way of educating yourself is don't wait until the end of your first semester or your first year to look at the student evaluation forms employed by your institution. When planning your courses, keep those questions on those student evaluations in mind. And in saying this, I don't mean to be overly cynical, and I'm not suggesting that you teach to the evaluations. However, if you learn that the form asks, for example, whether students understand the basis for faculty evaluations of their work, or if the forms ask whether students understand what is being asked of them on assignments, you might want to give some thought to those questions when constructing your syllabi, right? In other words, the syllabi can be constructed in a way that, that enhances the likelihood of positive assessments on student evaluations with respect to particular areas. So that's my first rule. Second rule. From day one in your new position, I would strongly recommend keeping a running record of everything you do that may eventually prove of relevance to your tenure file. Don't assume that you can do this adequately at the time of your tenure review, or even once a year in an annual activity report. You are sure to forget matters that might be of use to you. Years ago, I used to keep a yellow legal pad on the side of my desk, and after every talk I gave on campus, every presentation I gave at a conference, etc., I wrote it down. If I were doing this now, I would create a digital archive. I would probably invest in a document scanner so that when I signed an article contract with the journal, I could scan it and place it in my digital archive. I would probably also invest in an external hard drive that has plenty of storage space and reasonably good ratings on reliability. And I would probably organize that digital archive into various folders, one for teaching, one for service, one for scholarship, and so forth and so on. If you do, as I did a couple days ago, if you do an online search for online tenure portfolios, you'll find a number of helpful suggestions on this front. My third rule that will guarantee a successful tenure bid is one that has already been mentioned on several occasions here today. Do not let your research get off to a slow start. We all know how grueling the first years of teaching can be, and how hard it can be to carve out time to do scholarship. But, as others have pointed out, given journal acceptance rates, given the time necessary to do the inevitable revise and resubmit, and the time between formal acceptance of an essay and or an article or a book and its actual appearance in print, you cannot afford to wait. If this means politely declining certain forms of time-consuming service, as I believe Lisa mentioned, so be it. When I was chair of the Department of Politics at Whitman, I would always tell my junior colleagues, by the way, if the provost and dean, I so much regret this now that I'm provost and dean, but when I was department chair, I'd always tell my junior colleagues that if the dean comes knocking on your door asking you to serve on this or that committee, and if you feel that you cannot afford to serve, I, as department chair, will run an interference for you and explain to the dean that I had discouraged you to decline that request, right? Taking some of the onus off the junior colleague. Now, of course, I'm the one shamelessly asking junior faculty to do the same, and I hope that there are other department chairs who are making the same offer, even if it does mean that I get turned down now and then. Related to the issue of scholarship, as others have mentioned, get the two conferences early in your career so that colleagues from other institutions will become familiar with your scholarly work. You will need them when it comes time to soliciting external reviewers in conjunction with the tenure process. So, following the simple recipe that I've just outlined, tenure shall be yours if you're fortunate enough to hold a position where that is indeed a possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all the panel members for those comments. Anybody want to chip in anything else that's been stimulated, or should we just open it to questions? Okay.
But on occasion, I've been known to offer what I have called retention bonuses. In other words, a single flat sum. That way I don't have to build it into the salary base, and so I'm not committed to that sum in perpetuity. The final point that I would make is one that has already been made by others, is that you can't play this game twice.
Lady in the third row there.
Can you use the mic, please?
Sorry, get the mic from the...
Yes, actually, it's just piggybacking on the same topic, where if you, like right before you go up for tenure, you do decide to apply at other places. One of the questions I had was, just say you do go on the job market and someone asks you, well, why are you leaving if you're getting ready to go up for tenure? How do you handle that conversation so it doesn't appear as if, well, I think things might not work out? Doesn't that create kind of...
It's always a reasonable thing to say, because things might never work out. Everybody understands that. It's really the common practice to go out the year you're going up for 10 years.
So when you said if, it's not if, it's when you go out.
The year you are up.
You go out.
Absolutely normal, rational, everybody should do it, you should be on the market. Okay. And no one will think you're crazy. And the thing I added was, you're in your department, and there are things about your department that are great, and there are things about your department that perhaps you don't like, and it's difficult to know how much of it is them, right? Especially if you don't have that much experience, and how much of it is, the location or whatever, right? Like, it's good to meet other people you know, date other people, right, for a little while, right? You go see other people, you find out more about other departments, and you can understand what kind of, whether you want to stay where you are, too. I mean, I think you're also getting more information about sort of what is the place that is best for you in the long term.
Okay, thank you. Someone over here who's been waiting for a while. Take it, the mic.
Thank you. I have a question about teaching. I teach a course that has been considered a problem course. So my teaching evaluation's overall good. This one course, not so good. It's a PhD level advanced quantitative methods course, but it's required, so everyone has to take it, much to their horror and dismay. So what kind of information could I put in my packet to show that I actually do a decent job teaching that course, even though evaluations are low? For example, I've gotten letters from students who, this is in their area, so they enjoyed the class and went on to do some kind of quantitative position in government. With that, could I include something like that to show that at least someone enjoyed this course somewhere down the line? Or does that just look kind of desperate and just leave it as it is with evaluations?
I would say one of the things that you're required to do in your teaching statement is to talk about those very elements. And so I'm not sure how standard teaching evaluations are, but I know in ours, it says how much did you like the course, you get one rating, how much did you like the professor, you get another rating. So if you're noticing that students don't like having to take the course, but they say, given that I'm in this course, I really liked you, that's something that you really, really want to highlight. That, you know, I'm kind of in the same position because we have to teach government courses to people who don't want to take government courses. And so I often have to show the contrast. And the other thing is to keep emails and notes that students will send you complimenting you on the course, and having to incorporate that into the narrative of your teaching statement.
But that's where the digital archive really becomes helpful, because you don't want to have to go find that email some 5 years after it was written to you. The other thing I would suggest is that the most helpful teaching statements that I see as a non-voting member of the Personnel Committee are not those that simply reduce to some pious statement of teaching philosophy, right? I went into teaching because I'm convinced that education is the salvation of the world, the end, right? But rather those statements that include the pious platitudes, but then go on to do a course-by-course analysis, right? This is, right, these are the, whatever, 5 courses I regularly teach over a 2-year sequence, whatever. In this course, this is a required course. It generally secures lower evaluations for a variety of reasons, and do it course by course. That enables you to highlight the courses where your evaluations are really strong, but also to explain why it should be anticipated that the evaluations might not be so strong in this other course. So that level of specificity, I think, is a really good idea.
Yeah, and this is another area where you need to know what your process is, because you can have your teaching statement, but at least at Duke, there is a separate teaching review that's put together by, is Kerry, is it the Director of Undergraduate Studies? The Director of Undergraduate Studies, who goes through all the teaching evaluations of the person and then puts them in terms of where the departmental average is, which courses they seem to do really well in, and this is where the statements about people who teach methods, you know, look, there's a full 1-point difference in the evaluation for, you know, this faculty person on a substantive course and then on the methods class. So you need to know whether or not your teaching statement is the only teaching statement they're going to see, or if there's going to be a separate report done.
And I would also encourage you to talk among your colleagues about this as you go along each year. I mean, and just sort of conversation about the course, so it's in their minds and they understand the difficulty. Often they already will have an understanding, but it's important for you to make that case.
Thanks.
Microphone.
Basically, to the panel, what should be the approach for me to hit the market after a 2 decades gap? And this gap does not give me bad qualifications. It's a unique one because I have about 2.5 decades of teaching diverse populations in Ohio State University, four-year colleges, community colleges, on campus, online, as well as in two countries, India and US, mostly in US, since I started teaching in 1979. I also, during this phase of 2 decades, took a degree in web designing from DeVry, and 10 years I worked in IT industry. Good positions, EDI expert, hands-on. I did programming languages also, but my passion was not IT. So during all this time, why I took a break from PhD at the tail end from Ohio State University in '87 was I raised my daughter by myself. She's a gynecologist today, and I'm back to my passion of teaching. I'm starting my PhD, not starting, but the dissertation part was left, so I'm going to take some courses for about a year, take my comprehensives, finish my PhD. I will come to your question that when you say that when you go into the market in 20s, you have 30 years. As far as my physician or family history is concerned, they're giving me 30 years. I have nothing else to do. So I'm starting where people in their 20s are starting, but as far as the intellectual, the brain potential or the physical potential is concerned, I ride 100 miles of biking every week. And brain-wise, it's great. So what I'm trying to say is, how should I hit the market with all these qualifications? And this was I'm very happy with the choice that I stopped my PhD, because I did not focus on anything else, no dating, no marriage. This is life. This is life. And I raised her by myself. It was not easy. And she's a gynecologist, married, and I'm a 2-month-old grandma.
Yeah, let me take a stab at the question. And I think I would first say you would hit the market like anyone else would hit the market. And that is, when you put together a job packet, you have a cover letter, and often there are things you may want to, in some ways, explain in a cover letter. But in some ways, I mean, you're finishing a PhD, and if you first need to decide where you want to be, what type of institution you want to be. Yeah, and so how you fashion your own job file will be important. And so I think it should look like any other file. And if you're applying to research institutions, they're going to look at the quality of the research you've done as a graduate student. If you are applying to teaching schools, they're going to assess your ability to teach good courses and to be engaged with undergraduate students. So I think that's no different than any other person on the market in that sense.
The age would not be a problem there, because in IT industry it definitely is. And that's not my passion.
No, I've never been in a situation where age was discussed. Often, and gaps in a vita, or and sometimes it's self-explanatory. We look at the materials, but there may be things you want to add in a statement or have letter writers to mention in their letters about some gaps in career or change in careers. But I've never been in a situation where the age was discussed in that way. I don't doubt that it happens. I just
it's illegal.
No gap.
Yeah.
Study-wise, there's no gap.
Right.
Because whether it was adjunct position, I was doing at 3 colleges, or teaching online for 3 colleges. But then last year, I remember some of the panelists here. I'm in Washington, D.C. attending APSA meeting, and I got 2 emails that the colleges dropped me as an adjunct, and my income became 0. See, that's why I think it became important to me to finish PhD. Does that make sense? Because, thank you.
Well, here.
Who's first, but.
I want to go back to the conversation about, it's like not too far away from this, but when you're on the market, you have a job, but you're on the market, which you say is a pretty normal thing to do. But part of the reason why you're on the market is because your state system has constricted. Yes, I work for the CSU, and the resources have pretty much, gone away, and research is really tough to do. And so I'm just saying, how much do you say, like, hey, I'm this great person, I did all this service, I'm a wonderful teacher, I've got to leave because what they promised me was never materialized. I don't want to badmouth my institution, but I do want to be honest. So how does one walk that line?
To whom are you referring? You say that to whom?
Who you're applying to.
You're applying to?
Yeah, you don't want to be in the interview saying, well, this is what's wrong. At the same time, it's so bad, a lot of people don't really realize what's going on.
I would just say, as someone who went from a CSU to a UC, what I tried to do was focus on what I wanted rather than critiquing the institution as a whole. And so that, you go to a job, you don't know what it's going to be until you're there. And that I realized with my 4.4 load my first year that perhaps that's not how I wanted to be spending my time, right? And that I have this, so, focus on like, I have this research program, this is what I want to do. I would like to have graduate students. I would like to have research support. I would like to that you would want to be in a different, you've been in this institution, you like these things about it, but it's shown you that there are these other things that you would also want. And that way you don't get into the, they don't have paper for copies and, like you just but because the CSUs don't match, right? So the only option in the CSUs is to leave if you want, at least from a salary standpoint.
We don't need.
Stay positive, but right, and how that institution will serve your needs in a different way from the institution you're at, right?
Maybe on the other side of that, when candidates come, I want to know why they're interested in us, right? As opposed to why you hate the other place. Why is it, focus on that part.
Yes, on why they're wonderful, not why you're like jumping ship it.
Well, at the dinner, there's going to be the
don't drink wine.
It's just bad form to trash your current institution.
I know that.
I mean, it really is, because this discipline may seem like it's large, but it's actually quite small. Okay, so you just have to focus on what the institution where you're interviewing has to offer for you, why you think it would be a good fit, so forth and so on, but not what's wrong with where you're trying to leave.
But I wonder, and I'm not confident about this, and I'd be curious to hear what my colleagues think. I wonder if there's a way to explain why you're considering leaving as opposed to trashing the institution. I don't think I'd be surprised if I was the chair of a search committee and I got a cover letter that said that in light of the uncertainty of the economic circumstances of the CSU system, I think it's appropriate to look for a position elsewhere. And besides, I'm applying to your institution in particular because of all its many virtues. Is that right? That's explaining.
Yeah.
That's not trash talking.
I know that the rule not to trash, but there's some explaining that has to be done when you.
I don't think anyone would be surprised.
No, nobody would be surprised.
I think. No, we're all aware of the economic realities, and we all know that faculty at public institutions, no matter how much they may love where they are, the economics of the situation mean they're going to be on the market. They're going to be looking to go someplace else. So it's not something that has to really be explained, because we just, it's just the reality.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Just another quick question, following up on a point that the first panelist made. You said that it's a lot harder to go out on the market after you've been denied tenure. Can you elaborate a little bit on why that's the case?
Well, under normal circumstances, most institutions give you a year after. So if you are denied tenure, you'll find out by spring. But because the academic job market is annual, they'll give you an additional year at that institution where the presumption is you would find another position. I think I can't imagine how you could get yourself to go give a job talk. I just think it would be really hard in that, not that it's impossible, people do it, right? But I just think your position is very different from a position of strength versus a position of, they've just said no, it's almost I don't want to say desperation, but I just think it would just be psychologically more difficult to sell yourself in that context, I think. It's easier to do it the other way. People could disagree.
Another part of that, too, is the other institutions, and we all know how silly some of this stuff is, but schools may make a determination about you that once you turn out of your institution, for a number of reasons why you may not have fit that institution, may be good for mine, but folks in my institution may say, well, he's been turned down. We don't want someone that some place X turned down, regardless, it wouldn't look at. So it makes it somewhat more difficult at that stage as well. So it's easier to move before a decision, I think, than after.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I know of a case where an individual was offered a tenure job at a new institution. Her case had been positively voted on by her department. At the very last minute, the president of the university intervened and decided to deny her, and the institution that had made a tenured offer rescinded the tenure part. So they gave her the offer, but they made her come up again through their system in the following year. So it's better when no decision has happened. Yeah.
Kim, are we out of time? Or?
Yeah, we're just about out of time. I'm going to take 2 more quick questions. So your question, and then I'll take the other one, and then you guys can respond all at once.
Okay, I'll try to keep this quick. I would be interested, I think this is another institution-specific question, but I would be interested in the thoughts of anyone on the panel who has a strong opinion or an experience with this. In terms of teacher evaluations, I'd be curious how either your departments or you feel your institution as a whole handles trade-offs between higher student evaluations but also more, shall we say, generous grading on the part of the instructor. The idea that the instructor gives out lots of A's. I mean, I think there is a correlation there between one way to get your student evaluations up on margin is to treat your students nicer. And I'm curious how your departments, how your institutions are on the lookout for that or process that.
I'd be careful with that. Oh, I'm sorry.
One last question.
So if you're going on the job market in your tenure year, and one of the reasons may be because your spouse is also on the job market, could you talk about, so could you talk about whether, spousal hiring and such is something to take into account? And also, is it good to have a letter from somebody within the department if the department is very supportive and generally wants you there, but understands why you need to go on the market?
Okay.
Let me take the teaching evaluation question. So easy grading may be a way to good evaluations, but often I think it's not. I mean, students will often, at least at the institutions where I've taught, will say that the course was too easy. They have this, at least the evaluations have, how difficult was the course or how much time was required. And I find that students want a challenging course. If they think it's too easy, they'll say it and they'll criticize it for it being too easy. So be careful. I mean, I think so, and that comes out clearly. You can tell whether the person was giving away grades because the students would tell you, and committees look at that information sometimes.
Yeah, we have a formal grade inflation statistic that gets circulated throughout the colleges, and so our chair will get a list of all of all the full-time faculty and where they, and we're ranked in order of our grade inflating. And if we're above a certain mark or below a certain mark, we're kind of publicly ridiculed via email about that. I mean, there's no formal sanctions, but I know. Yeah. So it just depends on the institution. And I agree with Kerry. Giving out A's, if you're trying to boost your teaching evaluations, giving out A's probably won't do it. You probably want to look at your teaching. Because it's an easy A, but you're still a bad teacher, which is worse.
Thank you.
And I'm also quick.
Yeah, the last question.
Yeah, I'm a two-body person, meaning my spouse is also an academic in the same field, and his office is across the hall from mine. And so initially, you probably want to downplay that. You want them to love you, and then say, we want you so much, we want this body, but you don't want to do anything that's going to scare them off initially by saying, before you even have an offer in hand, there's two of us and you must take both of us.
Yeah. Okay, Lisa? Okay, please join me in thanking the panelists. And I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Kimberly Mealy. I work for the American Political Science Association. If you ever have any questions about professional development or education or diversity initiatives, please email me. I'm on the website. And thanks so much for coming. If you didn't sign in on the spreadsheet, please do, and we'll follow up with emails. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
So where did I go? It's not quite happy hour.
Hey, how you doing?
But
today, there's that. Okay, good.